The package was the color of old straw and lighter than it looked. I noticed it because the courier left it on the bench under the window, where Son makes a habit of telling truth about dust. The label faced upward and wore the name of my grandparents in the corner where senders carry their small hopes. It had been rerouted to our address, which happens when people learn to be clever but not careful. I am Maya, and I study how people use digital products for a living. I spend my days watching human hands try to explain what a mind is doing. That morning, I set my laptop to sleep and walked to the doorbell camera to check the clip that confirmed what I already knew. The box had arrived at 9:43. My son Theo had been at preschool. My husband Ethan had been at work. I had been making notes about a user journey. The box had waited on the bench with a patience that was almost aggressive. Inside the box lived a home DNA kit. I know the brand because the logo has spent fortunes teaching people to trust it. The brochure promised answers in a friendly voice that does not know how to keep quiet. The registration card had been filled in by hand with my grandparents, address and the date. The consent line at the bottom was blank. I stood very still in the foyer and listened the way you listen for a drip in a wall. A surge of heat rose in my chest and then passed through like a weather front that refuses to change the season. I took photos of the box, the label, the contents, the instruction sheet, and the blank line. I placed the items back in the box and set it on the dining table. Then I sat and let my breathing choose a speed that would not break anything I would need later. This is what happened next. I called our lawyer. Her name is Petra, and she carries calm, like other people carry perfume. I told her what had arrived and what I suspected. I told her about an argument the previous weekend at my grandparents' house, where my grandmother, Evelyn, had said that our boy looked like no one in the family and had asked whether I had any papers to show who begot who, as if a child were an heirloom and not a person who laughs at birds. My grandfather Harold had stayed quiet and looked at the floor the way a man looks when he knows he signed something he did not read. I had praised the pie and changed the subject. Petra told me to bring the box to her office and not to touch the swabs or the paperwork any further. She asked me to send the doorbell video and a shot of the label. She also asked me to write down what we had said at the last family dinner as soon as I could bear to write it. She said memory is a bad accountant, and that the sooner I switched to paper, the fewer fees I would pay later. I wrote in plain words about the question Evelyn had asked, and about how she leaned forward as if truth might be living in my jawline. I wrote about how Harold had poured more coffee and then wiped a ring from the table with the edge of a napkin, as if cleaning could make a suspicion polite. I wrote about how Ethan had put his hand on my thigh under the table, like a benediction that does not need an audience. I wrote that I had said enough when Evelyn suggested a cousin had a kit, and that it would be educational and that it would be welcome if we were proud of our blood. That phrase, proud of our blood, had felt like an alarm that was trying to disguise itself as a flag. I cut the scene from my memory and pinned it to the page where it could not hide in shadows anymore. That evening, Ethan and I sat with the box between us. He has a face that can hold more than one thing at once: hurt, anger, love. He asked whether I wanted to drive over to their house that night. I said no. I said I wanted daylight and witnesses who know how to write. I said I wanted to pick up Theo from preschool like any regular day and give him blueberries and wash his hands and watch the way he lines them up before he eats. I said I wanted to baptize this fire with patience. Ethan nodded, and the nod tasted like restraint rather than surrender. We put the box in a paper bag and slid it into the hall closet on the second shelf where the vacuum used to live before Ethan decided to give it a more honorable place. I texted Petra that the box was secure and that we would be at her office at 10. The next morning, Petra held the box like a surgeon holds a new instrument. She photographed what I had photographed and then measured her words. A home kit without consent is a problem when the sample comes from a minor. If Evelyn and Harold had collected anything from Theo without permission, that action could be a violation of privacy laws and also evidence of a plan to interfere with our parental rights. The box might also be nothing more than a failed attempt to persuade us to cooperate with their curiosity. Petra said we needed to be generous with our assumptions in our mouths and ruthless with them in our files. She would draft a letter for them and for the company. The letter would demand that no processing occur and that any material sent by anyone other than a legal guardian be destroyed. She would also ask the company to preserve all logs of registration and shipping and messages to and from the account attached to the kit. I thanked her and felt the specific relief that comes from professionalism doing its quiet work. That afternoon, I picked up Theo from preschool, and he told me that he had learned a new song about a turtle who figured out how to cross a road with patience. He sang it in the voice he uses to mimic his teacher. I listened and watched the mirror and thought about family as a road with many lanes and a lot of people who do not read signs. When we got home, he asked for his train set. I sat on the rug and pushed a small engine around a loop, while my mind placed the grandparents I once had in the museum where they belong. Museums are safe for old things. Living rooms are for the present tense. 2 days later, we learned that the kit had been activated online using an email address that belongs to my grandmother. The company verified this with one of those clean replies that legal departments write when they have learned how to be useful without being interesting. They confirmed that no samples had been processed. They had not yet received anything in a return envelope. They said the account holder had visited a help page about how to collect a sample from a toddler. The page is public. The page carries a warning about consent and about chain of custody and about testing policies for minors. The page also carries a note that people ignore when fear begins to steer. The note says that home kits cannot establish legal parentage. Only tests under chain of custody do that. Only labs that document every transfer of swab to label to seal to courier can carry truth into court. We printed the message and put it in a folder that would one day be a story without adjectives. Petra sent a second letter that felt like a firm hand on a rail. It notified Evelyn and Harold that a legal DNA test under chain of custody would be performed for all three of us. Me, Ethan, Theo. We would do it at a lab that knows how to speak to judges. The letter invited them to stop their project and to attend instead to whatever in them had become hungry enough to break trust. It also asked them to stop spreading rumors that I had been unfaithful. It is a strange sentence to read about yourself when your daily sins include working late, hiding chocolate from your own child, and forgetting to water the basil. When the letter arrived at their house, Evelyn called Ethan and cried as if the paper had accused her of treason. She said she only wanted the best for Theo. She said she wanted to make sure that he truly belonged to the family. Ethan told her that Theo belonged to us and to himself, and that a blood test does not grant a child membership into the Dignity Club. She asked whether we would forgive her. Ethan said forgiveness is available when harm stops trying to pretend it was a favor. After he hung up, he sat on the porch steps and stared at his hands. He said he loved his grandparents, and he also wanted to tear the kit into confetti and salt the earth under their mailbox. I told him that both feelings can live in one chest when that chest belongs to a person who grew up in rooms where love and harm were served on the same plate. We decided we would not invite them over until after the lab work and until after my heart had found gravity again. On the day of the test, we went to a building that trusts glass and light. The waiting room contained 2 other families who looked like they had driven from a distance to collect a truth that would help them rest. Our intake tech introduced herself and asked for identification. She asked Ethan to confirm his full name and date of birth. She asked me the same. She asked to see Theo's birth certificate. Then she asked whether we understood that this was a legal test with a chain of custody. She explained that swabs would be opened in our presence and sealed in our presence, and that we would watch the labels meet the samples and the envelope meet the tamper tape. She asked if we had any questions. Ethan asked how long it would take. She said 7 business days. She used a tone that turned those days into something you could live through without ending every evening blurry. Theo sat on my lap and made jokes about the big chair and the swabs and the idea that his mouth was going to help adults understand adult problems. He is 3.5 and sees the world as a lab that offers experiments to the brave. He liked the way the cotton felt. He liked the way the tech counted out loud. He liked the sticker she offered him for being a hero. Ethan went next, and I went last. The tech sealed the envelope and wrote the time while reading the numbers on the labels twice. She looked up and said that the room had just finished its important work. I wanted to hug her because some people move through the day turning tasks into kindness without becoming sentimental. Instead, I thanked her and took the receipt and folded it into my wallet with the care of a person who has learned what to value and what to release. Those 7 days spread themselves across our week like a slow quilt. I worked. Ethan worked. Theo built cities on the rug where trains never collided because he has inherited my preference for rule-based fun. I checked the porch 3 times a day for any packages that should not belong to us. The doorbell camera did its job. It saw couriers and neighbors and a teenager selling candy for a team he could not fully describe. It did not see my grandparents. It did not see any more kits. Somewhere in their house, Evelyn was talking to someone about what she had done and about how she had done it for love. Somewhere in that same house, Harold was listening to a sports radio show that keeps him company most afternoons and pretending he could not hear a storm try to name itself as virtue. On day 5, Petra called with an update that did not contain the one fact we still needed, but offered others. The company had acknowledged our preservation request and had shared with us a copy of the messages my grandparents sent to customer support. Their account had asked whether saliva collected from a straw would work. The agent had replied with clear language about consent and accuracy, and the need for fresh samples collected as instructed. The account holder had replied with a thank you and a string of emojis that tried to look like gratitude. I printed the exchange and added it to the folder. I sat at the kitchen table and let sadness be a guest for a while. I did not feed it very much. I did not make it sleep on the couch. I let it tell me a story about how people can do harm with the best words in their mouth and the worst fears in their gut. Then I walked it to the door and asked it to try the neighbors if it needed a place to stay longer. When the result arrived a week later, it did so in a PDF that Petra forwarded with a subject line that respected the gravity of the moment without trying to dress it up. Ethan is Theo's father. The report included the numbers that teach probability to behave like a handshake. It included the verification of chain of custody and the path of the labeled envelope from room to room. Ethan sat across from me at the dining table holding his phone like a person receiving news about weather from the horizon. His eyes brightened and then went quiet and then brightened again the way a sky does when clouds have the decency to move. He stood, went to the hallway, and came back with the paper bag that had held the kit. He set it on the table and said we should decide whether to return it with a letter or to keep it as an exhibit in our private museum. I decided that museums already had enough. Petra drafted a letter to my grandparents that carried the result and a request. The request was short. They were to stop discussing the paternity of our son with anyone. They were to destroy any swabs or materials they might have collected in violation of our rights. They were to confirm in writing that they had done so. If they had shared rumors with family, they were to correct those statements with a note that we would approve before it went out. If they refused, we would seek a protective order and a formal plan for visitation that would keep our child safe from being turned into a tool. The letter was not angry. It was precise, and it was tired of being polite to harm. We waited for a reply. 2 days passed. Then 3. On the 4th day, a message arrived from Evelyn that tried to make room for sorrow and for pride at the same time. She said she was sorry for any upset. She said all she had wanted was security for the family name. She said the world is strange and that children need roots. I read the message twice and saw the shape of the thing that fear had made in her. A root that wants to prove itself will drill through any pipe in a house if a house fails to defend itself. Our house would defend itself. I called Ethan and we agreed to set a meeting in a neutral room with a mediator who understands how to keep older people from treating apologies like theater. The meeting took place in a community center conference room where chairs have learned to serve arguments without breaking. The mediator opened with ground rules that gave each person a chance to speak for a set amount of time without interruption. Evelyn talked first. She spoke about her father, who taught her that the family tree had to be guarded or it would be overtaken by vines. She spoke about a cousin who ran off with a traveling musician and never wrote, and how her grandmother died believing that blood was sacred and that warnings often arrived too late. Harold spoke next. He did not defend the kit. He said he had not known how to stop a tide when it began to pull. He said he had worried that if he opposed her, she would sink deeper into the story she had made, and that the only way out would be loss. He said he was sorry to me and to Ethan and to Theo. He said the child deserved a family that did not turn him into a lesson on paper. I spoke last. I told them about the day the box arrived and about the way my heart had reacted like a fire alarm. I told them about custody and law and consent. I told them about the lab and the chain and the tech reading numbers out loud. I told them that Theo is a human boy who likes trains and soft pretzels and the sound of rain on the porch and the way birds seem to know rules none of us taught them. I told them that love for a child is not a certificate you frame, but a habit you repeat. The mediator asked whether any agreement could be made. Ethan said we would allow visits with Theo every other weekend for a few hours at the park while we were present. He said there would be no alone time with him until trust had grown new legs. He said any mention of DNA or paternity in Theo hearing would end the visit. He said there would be no collecting of straws or hairs or any objects from our child. He said the bag acts end here. Evelyn bristled. Then she deflated as if some valve inside her had opened. She said yes. Harold said yes. The mediator wrote the terms and we all signed. It would not have mattered if they had refused. Petra had already drafted a motion to make the same thing happen through the court, but I preferred that we all look at our own hands and write the new rules together. Sometimes law works better when it arrives in the voice of a family rather than from a bench. Ethan took Theo to swing after the session, and I watched the two of them move through air with matching grins. I felt a fierce gratitude for numbers that tell the truth and for paper that makes strong boxes around anger, so it cannot grow teeth. In the months that followed, we practiced our agreement with the care of gardeners, learning a new climate. The first visit at the park was awkward. Evelyn brought a bag of toys that Theo already had at home. Harold brought a book about trains from a library sale where the cover had been mended with tape by someone patient. Theo studied them both like a scientist. He asked Harold to read the book. Harold did, and his voice carried the timbre of a man who has been reading bedtime stories for longer than I have been alive. Evelyn watched and tried not to instruct. I could see her jaw twitch when Theo chose the book over the toys. Ethan sat beside me on a bench, and we shared a small smile that had earned its right to exist. After the reading, Theo ran to the swings, and I pushed, while he shouted that he was higher than birds, and then lower than grass, and then higher than birds again. Evelyn stepped closer and asked if she could push next. I said yes, and then stepped back far enough to remind myself that I was still in charge of the sky above my child. She pushed with a gentle rhythm and said she remembered doing this with Ethan when he was very small, and that he would not let her stop, and that her arms ached in a way that made her grateful to have arms. I heard a memory in her voice that had not been weaponized yet. I decided to let that memory stand on its own feet without asking it to apologize for its neighbors. We kept visiting the park every other weekend. Harold brought a kite one day and taught Theo how to read wind. He told him to watch the edge of the kite more than any noise in his ears. Theo learned quickly and ran with the steadiness of a small person who believes in string. Evelyn brought homemade cookies, and I asked about the ingredients because Theo reacts to some nuts with a drama that ends in meetings. She handed me a card with the list, and I realized she had made a new habit that could replace an old one. Ask first. She nodded when I praised the card. Her eyes softened in the way a dangerous animal softens when it learns that it can eat without stealing. Time did what time does when you stop asking it to skip lessons. We did birthdays and winter holidays without any more boxes that made me ache. Petra sent a follow-up letter to the company that confirmed destruction of any materials and closure of the account that had activated our alarm. The company replied with corporate courtesy that still felt like a kindness. I added the letter to the folder and then put the folder in the drawer behind passports and a flashlight and a stack of batteries. I returned to the living room and sat cross-legged on the rug and helped Theo build a terminal for his train city. He made loud air announcements that made no sense, and all the sense at once. Ethan filmed 30 seconds and then put his phone down because the real show lives best in unrecorded light. Not every moment was clean. Evelyn slipped once and told Theo that he looked like he had the nose of a man she had known in her youth. I read her face while the sentence left it, and I could see the panic as she realized what she had done. I said that Theo's nose looked like a nose that belonged to a boy who loved wind and apples. The subject changed into weather, and we did not need to open the agreement and point at the clause that would have let me end the day right there. I am not the chief of a courtroom. I am a mother who knows how to measure harm and choose response with a scale that is not interested in vengeance. Another day, a cousin posted a tone-deaf message on a family thread about how real families handle doubt boldly, as if boldness were a synonym for trespass. I left the thread and did not return. Petra reminded me that some battles are just invitations to perform, and that dignity knows how to decline. I baked a loaf of bread, and we ate it with butter and silence, and the house noticed we had chosen peace again. Houses thank you by continuing to hold the roof in the right place. Ethan and I began therapy while all this unfolded. We needed a room where an adult with training could help us name things that had grown nameless under the pressure of a story that had tried to make a family into an audit. The therapist asked us about our default reactions to fear. I clamped down on information and build a system. Ethan tries to make everyone in the room calm at once, even if it costs him. We learned to see each other before we saw the crisis. We learned to say that looks like fear to me and to let that sentence be the one that stands while the room settles. Our marriage found a new gate. It stopped trying to sprint through storms and started building better shelter. Theo grew, as children do when adults build safe rooms and ask storms to wait outside while they gather themselves. He learned to ride a scooter, and then a balance bike, and then a real bicycle with a secure stair that frightened me and thrilled me. He asked for the kite on blustery days and for books on quiet ones. He learned to spell his name and to tell a joke that made no sense to anyone over 10. He learned that people can behave badly and still be invited to bring cookies to the park. He learned that adults make rules to keep him from being turned into paperwork. He learned these things without lectures because lectures are not stories, and children deserve stories that teach without trying to be sermons. On the anniversary of the test, Ethan and I sat on the porch after Theo had gone to bed and watched the street pretend to be a river. We talked about how the past year had stretched and then contracted like a bellows. We talked about how family can mean well and still harm. We talked about how our grandparents raised us and how their fear of scarcity and love had made them believe in blood as a contract rather than a current. We talked about how law can be a kindness when wielded without spite. We talked about Petra and the tech and the mediator and the kite and the swing and the cookies. We did not talk about forgiveness as a policy. We talked about it as a practice. You do it by moving the hands of the day across a set of tasks that add up to good care. I wrote a letter to Evelyn and Harold that night. I told them about the porch and the quiet and the way the world has room for older people to change without being shamed by the outline of their old shape. I told them that we would keep visiting the park and that we would keep saying yes when they asked to bring kites and books and snacks that Theo could eat. I told them that we would not discuss DNA or blood or family names with a child. I told them that I believed they could learn to be grandparents who do not try to be historians. I did not send the letter. I put it in the drawer with the folder. The next time we saw them at the park, I said the important parts out loud in the small ways that a day makes room for kindness. I asked Evelyn about her garden and about whether the roses had survived the last cold snap. I asked Harold whether he wanted to race Theo to the tree line. People change when you give them something better to do than regret. There were setbacks. One winter afternoon, Evelyn called Ethan and said she had been thinking about a distant ancestor with a scandal and had wondered whether Theo would be ostracized at school if anyone ever questioned his place in the family tree. Ethan told her that children ostracize each other over lunch boxes and shoes and the sound of certain surnames. He told her that the place Theo holds in our home and in our lives is not a public vote. He told her that he would hang up if she continued in that direction. She stopped and then asked whether we would bring Theo over for soup. We said yes, and sat at their kitchen table and ate soup that tasted like someone had decided to warm their apology. Harold told a story about building a birdhouse with Ethan when he was small. Evelyn listened and touched the rim of her bowl like a person learning to play a new instrument with old hands. I sometimes think about the alternate timelines the kit could have made. A kit that was processed, a rumor that bloomed into a campaign, a custody battle engineered by fear pretending to be love. I think about those rooms, and I decide to stay in this one instead. In this room, there is a folder with a clean report and a stack of letters, and a recipe card with ingredients listed for cookies that do no harm. In this room, there is a boy who knows that adults do not use him as a prop. In this room, there is a marriage that grew new roots with their own traditions. On certain afternoons in this room, there is a kite waiting by the door because the wind asked for company. I keep a small ritual now when packages arrive. I stand at the bench under the window and I breathe. I look at the label and the sender and the weight. I ask a tiny question to the part of me that wants to be a fire. Are you a tool today or a spark? The answer tells me whether to bring the box inside or to leave it on the edge of the porch until I am ready to open it with steady hands. Most days I am ready. On days when I am not, I take Theo to the park and ask the sky to hold the box until I return. The sky is generous when you treat it like something other than a backdrop for fear. I also keep a record of small good things because a mind like mine likes to tabulate. The way Theo says the word engine and means a universe. The way Ethan chooses to make breakfast on Sunday and manages to keep every egg loyal. The way Evelyn counts cookies carefully and asks me to check the list one more time. The way Harold fixes the squeak in the gate without announcing it. The way Petra writes emails that turn swords into pens. The way the lab tech sealed an envelope and made a room safer. I write these things down in a notebook that sits by the bed, and when I cannot sleep, I read them the way some people read prayers. The effect is the same. A person remembers that they are not the only worker on the night shift of grace. When Theo turned 4, we invited both sides of the family to a park with a pavilion that had survived several election cycles and still managed to host hope. We grilled vegetables and hot dogs. We drew chalk train tracks on the sidewalk. We hung a banner that said only Theo because that was sufficient and excessive at the same time. Evelyn arrived with a kite that carried tiny stars over a field of blue. Harold arrived with a new book about a train that speaks in whistles. Ethan lit candles on a cake that looked like a small mountain covered in snow. Theo blew out the lights with a concentration that made strangers clap. I snapped a single photo and then put the phone in my pocket, because the real gift of such a day is to stand in it fully without grabbing proof. At the end of the party, Evelyn asked if she could hold the marker while Theo signed his name on a thank you card we had made for the park staff. I said yes, and Theo printed his letters with the kind of pride that does not need a witness beyond the page. Evelyn smiled and said that letters can be homes if you build them honest. She looked at me as if asking whether that was allowed. I said it was. Honest homes can hold both shame and change, without spilling either on the floor. We cleaned the pavilion and took the trash out and left the place better than we had found it. That is another ritual I have adopted. Leave the space cleaner than your pain found it. It is old advice. It works. A year later, my grandparents asked whether Theo could spend an hour with them at the library while Ethan and I ran an errand nearby. My pulse added a degree of caution to the answer. I said yes, and then added that we would be in the lobby reading a magazine the whole time and that they were to keep him in the main room within sight of the desk. Evelyn agreed. Harold agreed. We watched through the glass as they read in a sunlit corner. Theo sat between them like a person who belongs to his own book. When the hour ended, he ran to us with a sticker that said Reading Club and asked if he could come back next week. I said yes, in a voice that surprised me with its confidence. Trust like muscles, grows when you ask it to do work just slightly heavier than yesterday. I write this all down not because I need to prove it to anyone, but because my future self forgets things when life becomes generous again. She forgets how far a person can drift when fear masquerades as care. She forgets the power of paper and the peace of a plan. She forgets that family can be rebuilt not by blood, but by a record of visits and meals and jokes and repeated choices that favor the living over the ledger. So I write it down for her and for Theo, and for the version of Evelyn who will one day sit at a table and tell a story about how she learned to put the kit in the trash and the card with the recipe in her purse. For Harold, who will remember the sealing of an envelope and the sound it made when a room became safe again. If a person reading this finds a box like the one that sat on my bench, I hope they will do what we did. Breathe, photograph, call counsel, move the conversation to paper. Choose chain of custody. Place the child far from the stage. Invite law to behave as a shepherd rather than a stick. Ask grandparents to become grandparents again. Believe that apology does not erase harm, but it can seed a change in habit. Keep appointments with the park, with the swing, with the kite, with the book, with the cookie made with safe ingredients. These acts are small. They build a life that does not need to shout blood to hold together. My family is not perfect. We are a set of people living in a house of days. We will forget and remember and repeat and adjust. We will fight about bedtime and about the sound an old refrigerator makes when it believes it deserves retirement. We will need to replace the roof one season and the tires on the car in another. We will laugh at the wrong things sometimes and the right things rarely enough to make those moments matter. Through it all, I plan to keep a folder that tells the truth and a calendar that tells me where to be when love needs a body and not a theory. The package that began this story no longer lives in our house. I kept the ribbon because I am sentimental and I am allowed one indulgence. The box went to the recycling bin with all the care a ritual deserves. The lesson remains. Consent is a door. Rushing through it makes splinters. Asking for it and waiting for it builds a house that does not need to hide anything behind drapes. Theo is asleep now in a room where trains rest and a kite dreams of wind. Ethan is in the kitchen putting dishes in the rack the way he prefers. The night outside is the right temperature for forgiveness to set. I lock the door and check the porch and turn off the light, and I say to the house that we did good work today. The house does not answer. It already said yes when the doorframe met the latch without complaint. In the weeks after the library visit, I noticed small signs that our agreement had begun to write itself into the habits of my grandparents. Evelyn would text before stopping by the park, and her messages carried plain details rather than vague invitations. Time, place, snack plan. She asked about sunscreen and about hats. She brought a small bottle and asked if our brand was acceptable. I said yes, and felt a notch of trust settle into its groove. Harold started leaving small notes for Theo on plain cards, with drawings of engines and cabooses that looked like he had copied them from an old manual. Theo saved the cards in a shoebox he had decorated with stickers. He called it the train post and asked every Friday if there would be mail. We tried a new thing during visits. We asked Evelyn to tell one story from her youth that did not involve anyone failing a family standard. At first, she reached for the same old tales of caution and boundary and duty. Then she found the story of a summer when she learned to swim in a lake that had a dock and a rope swing. She described the cold shock of the first drop and the way the world went quiet underwater and then louder when she surfaced. Theo listened as if the air had leaned closer to hear better. Evelyn smiled without trying to teach anything. That smile fixed something inside the day. Harold taught Theo to knot two lengths of string together in a clean way. He said knots are the parts of us that refuse to let go, and that if you tie them well, you can rely on them without needing to stare. Theo practiced on shoelaces, and then on kite string, and then on yarn that he found in a drawer. Later, he tied a ribbon around a stack of his books and said he wanted to bring a gift to the librarian who had shown him where the train stories lived. We walked to the library and delivered the bundle. The librarian accepted it as if it were a treasure. She understood that the point was not the books, but the learning that a gift can be made of paper and intention. Ethan and I continued therapy, and it began to feel like maintenance rather than repair. We learned to schedule calm rather than wait for it to arrive as a miracle. Sometimes we met after dinner and walked through the neighborhood naming trees and porch lights we admired. Sometimes we sat on the floor and built a track while Theo slept, and we talked about work and about sorrow and about what courage looks like when it is done pretending to be a movie. We learned that courage usually looks like a person who sends a short email and then makes rice for tomorrow. The lab sent a survey asking whether the process had met expectations. I filled it out with gratitude for checklists and for rooms that resist drama. I praised the technician who read numbers twice. I praised the chain that did not break when fear pushed it. I praised the small clock on the wall that kept time without announcing itself. I did not mention the outcome because the process would have been worth praising even if the numbers had told a different story. Good process is a kind of weather that keeps crops alive. Our extended family adjusted in complicated and ordinary ways. A cousin who had been very loud online sent me a private message that said only I was wrong. I did not reply. Silence is a better teacher than a paragraph when someone has decided to ignore the math. An aunt sent cookies with a note that said, "We love Theo and we love you," and that was all. I put the note on the fridge because fridges deserve to hold words that do not ask for applause. Theo began asking questions about family. He had noticed that some kids call more than 2 people grandma and grandpa. He wanted to know how names work. I told him that names are coats that we lend each other and that we try to hang them back up in the right house when we finish with them. He asked whether Evelyn and Harold would always be his grandparents. I said that the plan was for them to grow old in that role with him. He nodded like a foreman who has inspected a beam and decided it can carry weight. One afternoon in early spring, I found Harold out by our front gate with a small toolkit. The latch had been catching. He had noticed it during the last visit and had brought a replacement screw that would take threads better. He asked if he could fix it. I said yes, and he worked while I stood with a glass of water and watched. He whistled a tune that had probably come from his father, and from his father before that. The gate closed quietly when he was done. He smiled a tired smile that said, "I am useful." I thanked him, and meant it with more than manners. Evelyn surprised me by taking a class at the community center on modern genetics. She told me over tea at the park that she wanted to understand what had frightened her so much. She said the teacher had explained that genes are not a staircase, but more like a braid, and that a braid can still be beautiful when strands come from different places. She said she had written down a sentence from the class. The sentence was that love does not need a percentage. I saved that line for a day when my faith in people thins out. Theo had a small health scare in late summer that sent us to urgent care for an ear that had decided to throw a festival. Evelyn called and asked if she could bring soup, and then added that she would leave it on the porch if we preferred no visitors. I said she could drop it at the door. She did, and the doorbell camera saw her set it down and step back and wave at the lens like a person trying to learn new manners. The soup tasted like carrots and apology warmed without words. Theo ate 3 bowls and fell asleep on the couch with the spoon still in his hand. During that season, I kept noticing how many people had helped hold our little world together. The preschool teacher who taught Theo to ask for space kindly, the barista who saw my weary morning and drew a small engine in the foam without charge, the neighbor who took our trash bins in when rain arrived like a guest who refuses to leave. I sent thank you notes. Ethan teased that I had become the postal service for gratitude. I told him that the stamp budget was still cheaper than therapy and that both were good investments. A year after the first kit, a box appeared on the bench again. My body reacted fast, but my mind asked me to wait. The label said it held a set of wooden train tracks that a friend had promised to send after her child outgrew them. I laughed out loud at myself and then carried the box inside. I told Ethan that my nervous system still believes in sudden weather. He said his does too, and that this is why we keep umbrellas by the door. We opened the box with Theo, who declared it the best mail day in history, and then proved his case by building a bridge across the rug. Harold had a health scare of his own that winter. He fainted while raking leaves and spent a night at the hospital while machines practiced their lines. We visited the next day. Evelyn looked smaller. I brought her coffee, and she took it in both hands the way people hold on to promises. Harold smiled when Theo walked in and asked for a story. He told one about a train that almost missed a station and then remembered in time. The machines hummed, and Harold's voice filled the room, and we did not need to say anything about the year behind us to know that we had traveled a distance. After Harold came home, we offered to help with chores. He refused on principle and then accepted help with the latter because principals do not belong on roofs. Ethan and I cleaned gutters and picked up sticks, while Theo and Evelyn sorted a box of old photos on the porch. She pointed out faces and told stories with less judgment than before. She stopped herself twice from making a claim about blood, and instead said, "Look at his eyes," full of mischief, and then laughed at her own restraint. Progress is often a smile that catches itself halfway and chooses a different path. I took Theo to the museum downtown, where a new exhibit explained how cities grow around rails. He moved from display to display with reverence. At a case that held a conductor hat, he turned to me and asked whether his great-grandfather had ever ridden a train. I said yes, and told him about a trip Harold had taken to join the service when he was young. I told the story carefully because service stories can turn into sermons by mistake. Theo listened, and then asked if we could take a train to visit our cousins someday. I said yes, and he began planning without letting the calendar slow him down. Sometimes the past sends a breeze over the present. We were at a family gathering when a relative started to talk loudly about heritage and who counts and who does not. I felt my jaw set. Evelyn put her hand on my arm and stepped forward. She said that the only heritage that matters at a table like this is whether people clear their plates and speak to each other with respect. The room changed temperature. The relative made a joke that did not land and then found a reason to step outside. I turned to Evelyn, and she looked as if she had lifted a small but important weight. It was not a victory parade. It was a turn in a hallway. Theo started kindergarten and came home with a library card of his own. He held it up like a passport. He asked if he could check out more books than his arms could carry. I said we would take a bag, and he approved of this plan. Harold insisted on meeting us there for the first checkout. He carried the bag like a porter with a smile that had seen decades. Evelyn walked slowly through the aisles and told Theo that the library had saved her sanity when she was a young mother. She said that the sound of pages turning is better than almost any medicine. Ethan received a promotion at work, and we celebrated with takeout eaten on the floor because new habits sometimes need new places to sit. We toasted with juice and water. We told Theo that promotions happen when people do their job well many days in a row. He said he wanted a promotion too and asked what work he could do. We told him that putting away toys without being asked would be a strong application. He nodded with the seriousness of a tiny manager and then made a chart on scrap paper that made us both laugh. The chart worked. Charts often do. One evening, I found Theo and Evelyn working on a scrapbook. She had collected photos from visits and postcards from train museums and the receipt from a kite store where the clerk had drawn a tiny bird next to the date. They arranged items on pages and wrote captions together. She did not mention blood. She wrote words like wind and reading and soup and swing. I realized that she was teaching herself a new language in front of us and that we were helping by refusing to translate the old one back for her when she stumbled. I had another conversation with Petra months later when a distant relative made noise about grandparents' rights in a way that suggested letters might start flying again. Petra reviewed our file and said it was strong. She suggested a short check in letter to remind people that the chain of custody result is conclusive and that any interference would be unwelcome and unsuccessful. I wrote the letter, and it landed without echo. The distant relative returned to posting pictures of sunsets, and we returned to the park with our kite. Not every spark becomes a fire when there is less dry brush piled in a corner.